Let's jump right in. Today, in this explainer, we are going on an incredible upward journey through the multi-layered operating system of the human mind. I want you to think of your mind like a supercomputer. We're going to break down the base hardware, the emotional code that regulates it, the social interface we show the world, and finally, the ultimate user experience, our search for meaning.
Here is our game plan. We'll start with how we think, move to the emotional sentinel, explore personality and courage, look at finding your flow, and then wrap the whole thing up with a search for meaning.
All right, part one, how we think, the base hardware. To understand the human operating system, you got to start at the foundational level. And our brain's decision-making wiring is largely defined by Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. He essentially mapped out the fundamental dual systems running in our heads. Notice the massive difference between these two modes of thought. System 1, that's your fast, automatic reaction. It's highly emotional, completely unconscious, and instinctive. It's the system that makes you slam on the brakes when a car suddenly swerves into your lane. But System 2 is slow. It's logical, and it takes real conscious effort, like when you're trying to multiply 17 by 24 in your head. Now, we all love to think we're rational creatures driven by System 2. But Kahneman's research proves that System 1 is actually running the show most of the time, constantly jumping to conclusions using these quick mental shortcuts.
And here's where it gets wild, because System 1 is super easy to hijack, especially by marketers. Take Robert Cialdini's principle of scarcity. His research proves our emotional brains instinctively panic over limited availability. We react way more severely to the risk of losing out on something than the potential to actually gain it. So when you see only 2 items left in stock online, your logical System 2 completely shuts down, and your instinctive System 1 takes over and forces you to click buy. I mean, come on, we've all been there, right?
Moving on to part 2, the emotional sentinel, glitches and guardians. So we know how the normal hardware works, but to really understand perception, we need to look at what happens when that base hardware fails.
So, I want you to ask yourself, what exactly happens when our cognitive wiring just breaks? The late neurologist Oliver Sacks spent his entire career documenting these fascinating and honestly sometimes terrifying neurological glitches. They really show us how fragile our grip on reality actually is.
Take the incredibly famous case of Dr. P. He was a brilliant music teacher who developed visual agnosia. Now, he could clearly see separate features, like a nose or a geometric shape, but his brain literally couldn't stitch them together into a whole cohesive object. The wiring was completely broken. It was so bad that as he was leaving Dr. Sacks's office, he actually grabbed his wife's head and tried to lift it off, literally mistaking her for his head. It is a shocking reminder of how heavily we rely on our internal software to make sense of the world.
Now, to understand how a healthy mind regulates itself without those severe glitches, we have to look at emotional intelligence. Look, for decades society thought cognitive intelligence, your IQ, was the absolute gold standard for success. But Daniel Goleman came along with this revolutionary argument that emotional intelligence, EQ, is just as critical, and maybe even more so, for navigating life, relationships, and even academics.
Here is the crucial biological point. Our emotional sentinel, that little almond-shaped part of the brain called the amygdala, matures extremely rapidly when we're infants. It gives us our basic emotional blueprint right away. But our neocortex, the part responsible for rational thought and cognitive training, that develops incredibly slowly. It keeps evolving all the way into adulthood. And this massive developmental gap, that perfectly explains why it takes a literal lifetime to master our emotional responses.
Goleman actually broke this mastery down into 5 distinct domains, and the absolute keystone here is number 3, motivating oneself through emotional self-control. You've probably heard of the famous marshmallow test. 4-year-olds who could delay gratification, meaning they waited for a second marshmallow instead of eating the first one right away, they mastered domain 3. And years later, those exact same kids scored over 200 points higher on their SATs than their more impulsive peers. So mastering your emotions fundamentally rewires your entire potential for success.
Okay, part 3, personality and courage, the social interface. We've got the hardware, we've got the emotional code. Now let's talk about how our innate temperaments and our vulnerability dictate how we actually engage with the world around us.
Susan Cain's research points out this fascinating historical shift in Western society. We basically moved from a culture of character, which really valued duty, morals, and quiet integrity, straight into a culture of personality, which absolutely worships the magnetic, the dominant, and the forceful.
And this shift really unfairly pathologized introverts, kind of treating their natural temperament as a flaw. But the truth is, introverts are just biologically wired to need less external stimulation. And let's not forget, they are responsible for some of humanity's most massive creative and intellectual achievements.
But whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, stepping out into the world takes real bravery. As Theodore Roosevelt so famously put it, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. It's a powerful quote, and it serves as the perfect anchor for researcher Brené Brown's transformative work on courage.
Brené spent decades studying shame and courage, and she basically flips everything we think we know on its head. She defines vulnerability as the uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure that is strictly necessary for courage. Now, we usually treat vulnerability like a weakness, right? Like a glitch in our armor. But her data proves the exact opposite. Vulnerability is absolutely not a weakness. It's actually our clearest, most courageous path to wholehearted living and genuine connection. You literally cannot step into the arena without it.
Which brings us to part 4, finding your flow, the user experience. So how do we optimize this whole system? Let's move to the highest level of our operating system to see how we unlock peak performance and optimal joy, using the brilliant research of psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He set out to figure out what makes an experience genuinely satisfying, and what he discovered was the state of flow. Flow is what happens when you are so completely immersed in an activity that you just lose track of time. Your worries disappear, your self-consciousness vanishes, and everyone from Olympic athletes to chess masters to painters experiences this kind of spontaneous joy. It acts as an incredibly productive antidote to everyday anxiety and mental chaos.
Thinking about it visually makes it super clear. Flow doesn't happen when things are too easy, and it definitely doesn't happen when things are impossibly hard. It hits that sweet spot precisely when your external challenges perfectly match your internal skill sets. That exact harmony is what continuously pulls us beyond our usual limits and forces us to grow.
And finally, part 5, the search for meaning, the ultimate purpose. We have reached the final layer of our human architecture. We built the hardware, the emotional software, the social interface, the user experience. But what is the point of it all? We're going to conclude this explainer with existential philosophy and finding our ultimate why.
Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl survived the unimaginable horrors of Nazi concentration camps during World War II, and while he was there, he mapped out these heartbreaking psychological survival stages of his fellow inmates. First, there was initial shock during admission, followed by a numb apathy to the camp existence, and finally, depersonalization upon liberation. But Frankl observed something really profound. He noticed that the inner hold a prisoner had on their spiritual self relied entirely on having hope for the future. Those who lost that hope, who lost their why, were doomed.
From that darkness, Frankl developed logotherapy. It's the theory that human beings are fundamentally driven by a will to meaning, and he identified 3 distinct ways we can discover this meaning. First, by completing a vital task or deed. Second, by experiencing love and caring for another person. Or third, and most profoundly, by facing unavoidable suffering with absolute dignity. Frankl realized that even when literally everything is stripped away from you, you always retain the ultimate freedom of choice, the freedom to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. Which brings us back around to you. Throughout this explainer, we've seen how fast instincts, emotional sentinels, social vulnerability, and deep flow states all wire together to create your reality. But you are the master architect. So I want to leave you with this. If the architecture of your mind is built on your choices, what meaning will you choose to design for yourself today? Take these insights, step into the arena, and go build something incredible.